In Tower Defense Simulator, events are limited time game modes which usually reward special towers upon completion. Every Black Friday and once during the springtime, the developers re-release a previously available event tower for Roblox.
Hello, I like money.
Because they cost real money, it's important to know how good these event towers are, and if they are worth spending your hard-earned cash on. In this video, I'll be going over the stats, uses, values, and capabilities of these towers, as well as ranking them based on how good they are. Before I continue, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to join the Blue Head Mafia. It helps me out a lot, and I really appreciate it. Also, if you want to talk to me, suggest videos, or maybe even be in one, consider joining the Blue Head Mafia Discord. It's a great time, and I hope to see you there. Starting off strong, we got the first ever event tower added, the Gladiator. The Gladiator has extremely short range, but is able to hit multiple enemies at once with its sword. At level 0, it costs 300 cash to place, which means you can place up to 2 of them on the first wave. The base Gladiator has a DPS of 1.98, giving it a DPS cost ratio of 6.6 DPS for 1k spent, which is fantastic value. But it gets better. That's only its single target DPS. We still have to account for the fact it can hit multiple enemies at once. Let's say the Gladiator is hitting 3 enemies on average. That will give it a DPS of 5.94 or a DPS cost ratio of 19.8 DPS per 1k spent. For comparison, the Golden Scout, which is often considered one of the best early game towers in the game, has a DPS cost ratio of 8.3 DPS per 1k spent, which is 2.39 times worse value. Needless to say, the Gladiator is incredible in the early game. 3 Gladiators can survive all the way to round 10 in Fallen mode, with hardly any leaks, which is really impressive for only 900 cash. The max Gladiator has a DPS of 78.74 for 11,050 cash in total. If you once again assume it's hitting at least 3 enemies, that gives it an average DPS of 236.22 and a DPS cost ratio of 21.38 DPS per 1k spent. But let's not forget that at level 3, the Gladiator gets the Warrior's Call ability, which increases the swing rate by 35%. When its ability is used, its DPS is increased to 319.9 DPS, giving it a potential DPS cost ratio of 28.86 DPS per 1k spent. That is just absolutely insane. Out of all the levels, the level 5 upgrade has the best value. The lowest is technically the level 3 upgrade, having a DPS cost ratio of 3.89 DPS per 1k spent. This is made up by the fact that it gains the Warrior's Call ability, since when activated it has a DPS cost ratio of 5.25 DPS per 1k spent. That means that the lowest value upgrade is actually the level 2 upgrade, having a DPS cost ratio of 4.72. The Gladiator's incredible DPS, splash damage, hidden detection, and high value lands it as a solid S tier. Not only is it one of the strongest event towers, it's one of the strongest towers in the game. Next up, we got the Commando. At level 0, the Commando costs 1,600 cash to place. It attacks using 2 laser guns and has a DPS of 3.94, giving it a DPS cost ratio of 2.46. This is already not off to a great start. Also, because it costs 1,600 cash to place, it's most definitely not an early game tower, and you can only pretty much use it in the mid to late game. At level 2, the Commando gains a rocket launcher, which gives it some added splash damage. These rockets are pretty much the only good thing about the Commando. At max level, the Commando fires 4 rockets instead of 1. The Commando costs a total of 22,150 and has a DPS of 50.64. That gives it a DPS cost ratio of 2.29. This is really not good. However, we need to account for the fact that it deals splash damage with its rockets. The rockets make up 7.33 of the total DPS. If you assume the rockets are hitting at least 3 enemies per hit, then you have an average DPS of 22. If we add that onto its laser gun's DPS of 43.31, we get a total average DPS of 65.31, or a DPS cost ratio of 2.95. Not a huge difference, but that makes it a bit better. The level 5 upgrade has the highest value, though the second best is the level 0 Commander, with a DPS cost ratio of 2.46 per 1k spent. And the upgrade with the worst value is the level 2 Commando, with a DPS cost ratio of 1.68 DPS per 1k spent, which is absolutely pathetic. So if you can't afford to fully max out a Commando, you're much better off just spamming level 0 Commandos. Undoubtedly, the Commando has horrible value. It's much too expensive for the DPS it gives, and not to mention, it can't even see hiddens. However, it does have some insane range, having a similar range to the turret. That means you can place it pretty much anywhere, and with its 65.31 DPS, it can deal some decent damage. And since the Commando has no placement limit, the maximum DPS you can get only using Commandos isn't that bad. In a quad game, you can place up to 20 towers. 20 Commandos adds up to a total DPS of 1,306.2. So while I agree the Commando is definitely a bad tower, I wouldn't say it's unusable. If you just want to have fun, and you're willing to sink a lot of cash into it, it can at least do something. And because of that, I'm going to rank it as a low to mid C tier. Next up, we got the Slasher. Like the Gladiator, the Slasher has a short range and is a melee attacker, stabbing at enemies with its knife. At level 0, it costs 400 cash to place, meaning you can place it in the first wave. Unlike the Gladiator, the Slasher does not deal splash damage, which means it struggles with crowds of enemies. The level 0 Slasher has a DPS of 2.98, giving it a DPS cost ratio of 7.45 DPS per 1k spent. That's actually surprisingly good. For comparison, the Golden Soldier, one of the best early game towers in the game, has a DPS cost ratio of 6.93. Because of its value, you may think that the Slasher is a good tower. Unfortunately, the combination of a short range and a slow attack speed means that it ends up leaking a lot of enemies. Also, the fact that it deals single target damage means that it heavily struggles with any crowd of enemies. At level 2, it does gain some crowd control as it now throws its knife every 4 seconds, which can pierce through multiple enemies. Max level has a DPS of 27.93 for a total cost of 5,800. It also now throws 3 knives instead of 1. It's pretty hard to estimate how many enemies and knives hit on average, but against a crowd, I'm going to estimate it hits around 5 enemies on average. That gives the throwing knives a total DPS of 25 and the Slasher a total DPS of 52.93. That's a DPS cost ratio of 9.13. While the Slasher may have overall good value, the fact it is an extremely close range tower just completely ruins it. Towers like the Gladiator, Sledger, or Warden all make up for this with special abilities or traits, which other than its knife throw, the Slasher has nothing that makes it stand out. Also, the Gladiator, Sledger, and Warden all have insane levels of DPS. I mean, the Gladiator and Sledger can both reach over 200 DPS, so that makes the Slasher's DPS not seem that impressive. Because of this, I'm going to rank the Slasher as a high D tier. While it's not completely useless, as if you spam it, it can do pretty well, it's overall a pretty bad tower. The Frost Blaster is essentially a better version of the Freezer. It freezes enemies in place for a short duration of time, serving as a support tower for your other towers. While the slow effect can be useful, it's really short. From level 0 to level 3, it only lasts for 0.35 seconds and the freezer fires every 3.008 seconds. At max level, it freezes for 0.7 seconds and fires every 1.508 seconds, which is a pretty big improvement. But what makes the Frost Blaster actually better than the freezer is that it has some semi-decent DPS. The max level has a DPS of 23.21 for a total of 12,400 cash. That gives a DPS cost ratio of 1.87 DPS per 1k spent. The level with the best value is level 3 with a DPS cost ratio of 3.43 DPS per 1k spent. While the Frost Blaster may give some decent support, it's incredibly outclassed by the Electroshocker, Warden, and Sledger. If you have any of these towers, which is far more likely than owning the Frost Blaster, there's genuinely no reason to use this tower. They're all much better at stunning and have way more DPS, with the Electroshocker and Sledger being able to reach over 200 DPS. Because of its underwhelming stun time and the fact that so many towers outclass it, it's undoubtedly terrible. However, I don't really think it's useless, as even if there's many options better than it, the little support it gives can still be helpful against units like the tank, which gets fully stunned by its freeze. It can also be used against a shadow boss due to getting hidden detection. And because it has no placement limit, if you spam a bunch of these guys, you can actually end up stunning a decent amount. And because of that, I'm not going to rank it as an F tier, I'm going to rank it as a low D tier. Don't get me wrong, it's still a terrible tower, but it has some uses. The Archer was recently re-released as a Game Pass for a limited time, and with that, it received a pretty significant buff, making it a lot better than it was before. The Archer costs 600 cash to place, meaning you can get it on the first wave. It fires arrows that pierce through enemies. Because of its pierce, it's best to place it in front of a straight path, allowing its arrows to shoot through as many enemies as possible. In most cases, the Archer will end up leaking a couple enemies on the first wave, though on some maps, with good placement, it can last a couple of waves without leaking. At level 2, it gains hidden detection, which means it can be used against the wave 13 and 15 hiddens. At level 3, the arrows now give a burn effect, similar to the Pyro. This is not stacked with other archers, meaning you're better off maxing a single archer at a time instead of upgrading all archers at once. The level 5 archer costs 13,400 cash and has a DPS of 19.89. Let's say that the archer is hitting the maximum amount of enemies each hit. The maxed archer has 7 pierce, which means it can hit 8 enemies at once. If we multiply its DPS by 8, we get a max DPS of 159.15. Without considering its burn damage, that gives the archer a DPS cost ratio of 11.88, which is actually amazing. That's almost twice as good value as the Golden Soldier. Now, the burn damage makes that even better. Before we account for the burn damage, how do we even calculate its DPS? On a single target, the max level burn deals 10 damage every second for 8 seconds, dealing a total of 80 damage. Since the archer has a pierce of 8, I would say a safe average number of enemies under the burn effect would be around 8, though this could be less or a lot more. If 8 enemies are burning, that equals a total added DPS of 80. If you combine that with the archer's 159.15 DPS, we get a total DPS of 239.15. That gives the archer a DPS cost ratio of 17.84 DPS per 1k spent. That's really good, and when combined with its excellent range and hidden detection, the archer can be a powerful tower. This all relies on a lot of factors though. The archer needs to utilize all of his spears to be good, and that means it's incredibly reliant on its placement. Some maps, like Grassy Isle, have no straight paths the archer can effectively use. That means that the archer is really map dependent, and that makes it a lot less reliable as a starter tower. There also may not be a lot of good spots on the map, meaning only a few archers can be used to their full potential. Also, since this early game is not fantastic, and the single target DPS isn't good enough to be considered a late game tower, it sort of only performs well in the mid game. Because of this level of uncertainty, and the fact that it's pretty much only good for the mid game, I'm going to rank the archer as a low B tier tower. It can be really powerful if used correctly, but there's so many factors that could affect its performance. The Swarmer could be obtained during the 2020 spring event. The Swarmer attacks enemies using bees, causing a damaging effect similar to the Pyro. It costs 300 cash to place, meaning you can place 2 of them on the first wave. They can perform relatively well for the first few waves, but they fall off pretty quickly. Normally, the max Swarmer only has a DPS of 16, which isn't great. However, there's a bug you can use that makes it just insane. You see, normally when an enemy is being stung by the Swarmers, other Swarmers are not able to attack it. That means that the bee swarm effect cannot stack. However, there's a couple of ways to get around this. First of all, if all Swarmers attack the enemy at the same time, then the swarms from all the towers will stack. Also, at level 4, the Swarmer gets a beehive ability, which sends out an explosive beehive which causes all enemies in the radius to get a swarm effect. This ability can't target enemies that are already affected, but it can target a nearby enemy without the effect and stack the effect on any swarmed enemies within the radius of the explosion. But to make the Swarmer even more powerful, there's a special trick you need to take advantage of. For some reason, when a Swarmer's effect ends, for a brief moment, other Swarmers will be able to attack the same zombie again. That means that if you have a zombie be attacked by level 0 Swarmer and a bunch of other level 5 Swarmers, the level 0 effect will run out quicker and allow the higher level Swarmers to attack the enemy once more, stacking the effect. You can take this even further by selling Swarmers. When you sell a Swarmer, their effect ends, which once again allows other Swarmers to attack the enemy. Let's say that on wave 40 you have 15 level 5 Swarmers and 5 level 0 Swarmers at the entrance. All the Swarmers will attack the Fallen King at the same time, stacking 20 swarms. We could then sell the level 0 Swarmers one by one, each sale allowing another 15 level 5 swarms to stack on the enemy. After we have sold all level 0 Swarmers, we would end up with 90 swarms stacked upon the enemy. Since each swarm has a DPS of 16, we would have a total of 1,440 DPS from all the swarms. That gives them a DPS cost ratio of 14.44 DPS per 1k spent. For a high damage late game tower, this value is incredible. Needless to say, if properly exploited for its bugs, the Swarmer can be extremely powerful asset to your loadout. The only unfortunate part about the Swarmer is that it lacks hidden detection, but as long as you bring a tower like the Golden Pyro to take care of hiddens, you should be fine. I'm going to rank the Swarmer as a solid high A tier. It takes a lot of setup and is really only good in the mid to late game due to how many Swarmers you need to best utilize it. But once it reaches its full potential, it can shred almost anything. The Sledger could be obtained during the Frost Invasion event. It's another melee event tower having a short range and attacking enemies with its sledgehammer. It costs 350 cash to place. A level 0 has a DPS of 1.99. It can't handle any of the early waves by itself, but if you're playing in a quad game, it could help out a little. At level 3, the Sledger freezes enemies for 2 seconds with each hit. This is what the Sledger is mainly used for, as a freeze effect can make handling enemies like the tank way too easy. Another thing about the Sledger is that if the Sledger hits an enemy that is already frozen, it'll do 2 times as much damage, though it will not reapply the freeze effect. The Sledger's DPS is a bit harder to calculate. At max level, when an enemy is not frozen, it deals 50 damage and freezes them, but it deals double damage to frozen enemies, so the Sledger alternates between dealing 50 and 100 damage. So after 2 hits, it will have dealt 150 damage. So that means for calculating its DPS, we can say it deals an average of 75 damage per hit, as 150 divided by 2 is 75. The max level Sledger can damage up to 4 enemies per hit, making it better at stalling crowds of enemies and greatly increasing its DPS. Its single target DPS is 59.62. However, because the Sledger's freeze effect causes crowds of enemies to stack up, it is reasonable to assume that it's hitting 4 enemies on average. That gives it a DPS of 238.48. It costs a total of 13,600 cash, giving it a DPS cost ratio of 17.54 per 1k spent. Because of the Sledger's high potential DPS, great stalling capabilities, and crowd control, I'm going to rank it as a low S tier. The only thing that is really missing is hidden detection, but I still think it's a great tower. The Toxic Gunner could be obtained during the Halloween 2020 event. It costs 400 cash to place. It attacks in bursts, similar to a soldier. At level 0, it has a DPS of 1.79. That gives it a DPS cost ratio of 4.48, which isn't terrible, but roughly half as good value as the level 0 Golden Scout. While it's not terrible in the early game, it's not able to fully defend by itself. At level 2, the Toxic Gunner now applies a poison effect, which deals 1 damage every 0.5 seconds, which is a DPS of 2. Also, every hit applies a 10% slowdown up to a cap of 50%. The poison effect lasts for 0.5 seconds, while the slow lasts for 3 seconds. On paper, this sounds amazing. Who wouldn't want a 50% slowdown on all enemies? However, when testing it, it felt off. When asking around, most people said it's not actually a 10% slowdown. Unfortunately, it's hard to know for certain what the actual slowdown is, but all I can say is it's not a lot. Okay, so while I was making this video, a friend of mine, Sinister Pumpkin, made a video about the Toxic Gunner where he tested out the slow effect on a tank. So if you'd like a more in-depth look at the slowdown, make sure to check that out. I'll put a link in the description. You can honestly not tell that big of a difference from the slowdown, and when the entire main purpose of the tower is to slow down enemies, that's not good. Slowdown aside, how good is it in terms of DPS? At max level, it has a DPS of 24.81. The poison effect will deal a total of 1 damage as its tick rate is the same as its duration. I recommend setting it to random targeting. This allows the Toxic Gunner to attack multiple enemies, spraying the poison and slowdown effect as efficiently as possible. If we do this, the poison is essentially a +1 damage per shot. That gives the Toxic Gunner a total DPS of 31.01 and a DPS cost ratio of 3.63, which is decent. Despite the slowdown not being great, it doesn't hurt to have a little extra support, and combining that with a semi-decent DPS and value, I'm going to rank the Toxic Gunner as a low C tier. The Executioner could be obtained during the 2021 Solar Eclipse event. It attacks enemies by throwing an axe in a boomerang motion, hitting multiple enemies at once. The Executioner costs 800 cash to place, so it cannot be placed in the first wave. It's best used as a crowd control tower. At max level, its axe can bounce onto 7 different enemies and hit even more on its way back to the Executioner. Adding that to the fact that each axe deals 80 damage and it throws every 2.008 seconds, the Executioner can rack up some serious damage. If you're hitting 8 enemies with your bounces and then hitting them all once again when the axe returns to the Executioner, that would mean that every throw would deal 1,280 damage, giving the Executioner a DPS of 637.45. At max level, the Executioner costs a total of 22,800 cash, giving a DPS cost ratio of 27.96 DPS per 1k spent. That is just ridiculous. Of course, this is assuming that the Executioner is hitting the max number of enemies possible, but I say it's safe to assume that it's hitting at least a third of this maximum DPS on average, which is 212.48. Also, the Executioner has flying level from level 0, making it an option against balloons in hardcore mode. It also gets hidden detection at level 4, making it an option for round 13 at 15, though because it costs 10,300 cash in total, it's quite an investment for such an early round. Unfortunately, the Executioner is not very good against single targets, being unable to deal significant damage against late game bosses. Its single target DPS is only 39.84, giving it a DPS cost ratio of 1.75, which is absolutely terrible. Because of this, I'm going to rank the Executioner as a low A tier. Despite it being a fantastic crowd control tower, having arguably some of the highest crowd DPS, the high cost and low target damage may cause you to struggle against later waves and is very dependent on its placement and can fluctuate a lot depending on the situation. The Elfcam could be obtained during the Xmas 2022 event called Ambush. It functions like the military base, spawning units at the end of the map which travel down the path to attack the enemies. As the Elfcam levels up, it gains the ability to spawn different elves, each having their own unique attack style. Now, I've already done an in-depth video comparing the Elfcam and the military base, so if you'd like to know which one is better, consider checking it out. I'll put a link in the description. But, finish this video first, please. The Elfcam costs 300 cash to place, meaning you can place 2 of them on the first wave. 2 Elfcams actually perform really well in the early game, surviving without any leaks until wave 8, which is actually more than 2 Gladiators. Though, because the Elfcam basically has full map range, the longer the map, the better it performs. In the Elfcam versus military base video, I calculated that the max level Elfcam has an average DPS of 189 for a total cost of 15,275. That gives it a DPS cost ratio of 12.37 DPS per 1k spent. The Elfcam can basically cover any threat, having high splash damage, high single target damage, full map range, hidden detection, and flying detection. This makes it incredibly versatile and very easy to use. Because of its great value and vast variety of uses, I'm going to rank the Elfcam as a low S tier. I don't believe it's as good as the Gladiator, but it's undoubtedly a fantastic tower. I really think the only thing holding it back is its placement limit, as you can only place down 2 of them. So, that's all of the towers. If you disagree with any of my rankings, feel free to let me know what you think in the comments down below. Also, I want to thank these members from my Discord as they helped me get the recordings of the event towers that I personally did not own. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to join the Blue Head Mafia. My name is CORSO, and I'll see y'all in the next video.